May 2, 2011. The hills of Abbottabad, Pakistan. As stealth helicopters pierced the night sky, a decade-long hunt was ending. But to understand this moment, we must look past the gunshots and the shadows. We must go back to a world of palaces, billions of dollars, and a shy young boy in the Saudi desert. This is the investigation into the metamorphosis of a billionaire's son into the world's most wanted man. This is the architect of shadows.
Childhood and family background. Our story begins in 1957 in the heart of Riyadh. To the world, the name bin Laden is synonymous with terror, but in the mid-20th century, it was synonymous with empire. Osama was born into the lap of unimaginable power. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was not just a businessman, he was a legend. A poor immigrant from Yemen who, through sheer grit, became the personal contractor to the Saudi royal family. Mohammed bin Laden was the only man allowed to drive his car into the royal palaces. He was the man who literally rebuilt the foundations of Islam's holiest sites. This was the world Osama was born into, a world where his family controlled the very ground the kingdom stood upon. Osama was the 17th son of over 50 siblings. In a family that was a miniature city in itself, he was known for being different. While his older brothers traveled to Lebanon or the West to embrace a cosmopolitan lifestyle, Osama remained tethered to the desert. Those who knew him in his youth describe a boy who was painfully shy, unusually tall, and deeply observant. His mother, Alia Ghanem, was from a modest Syrian family, making Osama somewhat of an outsider among his more royal half-siblings. But it was this quiet nature that masked a growing intensity. In the elite schools of Jeddah, he didn't just study civil engineering to follow in his father's footsteps, he began to study the world through a lens of strict religious devotion. By the time he was a teenager, the billionaire's son wasn't interested in the family jets or the London fashion. He was searching for a cause that was greater than his father's billions. The wealth provided him with a safety net, but the ideology provided him with a map. As the 1970s came to a close, a storm was gathering in the north, a Soviet invasion that would offer the young engineer the purpose he had been seeking. The construction of a terrorist was about to begin with the very tools he learned to use in his father's company.
The Gilded Cage, the empire of sand and steel. To understand the man who would one day haunt the dreams of the Western world, we must first look at the empire he inherited, not an empire of weapons, but one of sand, steel, and concrete. In the middle of the 20th century, the name bin Laden was the gold standard in the Saudi kingdom. Osama's father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was a man of legendary proportions. He wasn't born into royalty. He was a poor, one-eyed laborer from the Hadramaut region of Yemen who walked to Saudi Arabia in the 1930s to find work as a porter. But Muhammad had a vision that matched the ambition of the Saudi kings. Through sheer willpower and unmatched engineering intuition, he gained the absolute trust of King Abdul Aziz, a man so trusted by the royals that he was the only private citizen allowed to drive his car inside the king's palace. He saved the Saudi government from financial ruin in the 1950s by paying the salaries of all civil servants for 6 months when the treasury was empty. In return, he was granted the exclusive rights to rebuild the holiest sites in Islam, the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. This meant that while Osama was growing up, his family literally held the keys to the heart of the Islamic world. The bin Laden family was not just wealthy, they were a pillar of the Saudi state.
The 17th son in a sea of siblings. Osama was born in 1957 in Riyadh, the 17th son of over 50 siblings. In the bin Laden household, life was a chaotic blend of extreme discipline and unimaginable luxury. Mohammed bin Laden was a strict patriarch. He raised his sons like soldiers. He kept them on a tight schedule, often making them compete with one another for his attention. But within this massive crowd of brothers and sisters, Osama was an outlier. His mother, Alia Ghanem, was a beautiful, educated woman from a middle-class Syrian family. She was Muhammad's 10th wife, and she was often called the Syrian wife or the slave wife by the more prominent Saudi-born wives of Muhammad. This created a subtle sense of otherness for young Osama. While his half-brothers were the sons of powerful Saudi families, Osama was the son of the outsider. This status shaped his personality. He wasn't the loud, dominant alpha male. He was the quiet, tall, and slender boy who stood in the corner. While his siblings were being sent to London, Paris, and Switzerland for vacations, learning to fly planes and driving Ferraris, Osama was becoming increasingly drawn to the silence of the desert. The quiet youth, horses, westerns, and contradictions. There is a persistent myth that Osama was born a radical. The archives tell a different story. In the 1960s and early 70s, Osama was a boy of deep contradictions. It is a little-known fact that one of his favorite pastimes was watching American Western movies. He was fascinated by the rugged individualism of the frontier, a theme that would ironically mirror his later life in the caves of Afghanistan. He was an avid horseman, spending hours riding across the family's vast estates. Friends from his youth at the prestigious Al-Faghr Model School in Jeddah remember him not as a firebrand, but as a gentle giant. He was a boy who rarely raised his voice, a student who excelled in mathematics and civil engineering. At this stage, he was the perfect heir to the bin Laden construction legacy. However, the turning point began in those very school corridors. Al-Faghr was a place where Western-style education met the rising tide of political Islam. Osama began attending after-school Quran study circles, but these weren't just about religion. They were led by teachers who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, fleeing persecution in Egypt and Syria. It was here, in the quiet, air-conditioned rooms of Jeddah, that the billionaire's son was first introduced to the idea that the Muslim world was under threat and that it was the duty of every believer to defend it. His father died in a plane crash in 1967 when Osama was only 10 years old. The loss of the patriarch left a vacuum. Osama didn't turn to the boardrooms or the skyscrapers his father built. Instead, he began to look for a different kind of foundation, one built on an ancient ideology that would eventually set him on a collision course with the very Western world that produced his favorite films and luxury cars. The metamorphosis begins. As he entered his late teens at King Abdulaziz University, the transformation was nearly complete. He wore the traditional white tobe, he grew a short beard, and he began to spend his vast inheritance not in luxury, but in funding religious causes. He was a young man with $1 billion bank account and a burning desire for a mission. He didn't know it yet, but the Soviet Union's decision to cross the border into Afghanistan in 1979 would be the spark. The quiet, horse-riding engineer from Jeddah was about to leave the Gilded Cage of Riyadh forever. He was going to trade his father's construction cranes for the weapons of war. The billionaire's son was going to the mountains, and the world would never be the same again.
The intellectual shift, education, and radicalization. The architecture of a new mind. While the world saw a billionaire's son destined to lead a global construction firm,
A quiet, intellectual rebellion was brewing in the heart of Jeddah. In the mid-1970s, Osama bin Laden entered King Abdulaziz University. On the surface, he was a dedicated student of civil engineering and public administration. He studied the strength of concrete and the physics of structures. But beneath the academic facade, he was searching for a different kind of stability, a spiritual foundation that the modern, oil-rich Saudi Arabia could no longer provide him. The shadow of the mentors, Abdallah Azzam. It was in the lecture halls of Jeddah that Osama's life trajectory shifted forever. He didn't just meet teachers, he met architects of revolution. The most pivotal figure was Sheikh Abdallah Azzam, a Palestinian scholar with a PhD from Al-Azhar who was then teaching at the university. Azzam was a man of magnetic charisma. He didn't just teach theology, he taught action. He was the one who coined the phrase, "Jihad and the rifle alone. No negotiations, no conferences, and no dialogues." Osama wasn't just a student in the back row, he became Azzam's protégé. Imagine the scene, a tall, wealthy, and humble young man sitting at the feet of a fiery revolutionary. While his classmates were planning their corporate careers, Osama was absorbing a worldview where the borders of nations meant nothing, and the struggle for faith meant everything. Azzam provided the how, the call to physical struggle. But if Azzam provided the method, it was the teachings of Sayyid Qutb that provided the motive. Although Qutb had been executed in Egypt years earlier, his brother, Muhammad Qutb, was a professor in Jeddah and became another mentor to Osama. Through him, Osama was introduced to a terrifyingly binary world. Qutb's philosophy was simple yet explosive. The world was divided in two, the world of Islam and the world of Jahiliyyah, barbarism or ignorance. To Osama, the skyscrapers his father built, the Western music his brothers listened to, and the American influence in the Middle East weren't signs of progress, they were signs of Jahiliyyah. This was the ideological seed. He began to view the United States and the Soviet Union not as superpowers, but as twin cancers eating away at the purity of his faith. This wasn't just religion, it was a cosmic war in the mind of an engineering student who believed that for something new to be built, the old structure had to be demolished. The engineering lens, West versus East. This is where the interesting investigation deepens. How does an engineer think? They look for flaws, they look for stress points. Osama began to apply his civil engineering logic to global politics. He saw the West, led by America, as a decaying bridge held up by materialism and greed. He saw the East, led by the Soviet Union, as a godless machine. He didn't see himself as a politician, he saw himself as a restorer. He started using his massive personal allowance to fund secret study circles. He was no longer the boy watching Western movies. He was the man analyzing how to bring the West to its knees. He became obsessed with the concept of Ghuraba, the strangers, a small elite vanguard that would change history. He believed that if he could find the right people and the right moment, he could trigger a collapse of the current world order. By 1979, the shy student from the bin Laden group was gone. In his place stood a man with $1 billion bank account and a radical blueprint for the future. He was a ticking bomb of ideology, waiting for a battlefield. And on Christmas Eve of that year, when Soviet tanks rolled into the dust of Kabul, Osama bin Laden didn't see a war. He saw his destiny. The classroom was over. The engineering of global terror was about to begin. The ghost of Sayyid Qutb, the why of the conflict. But if Azzam provided the method, it was the teachings of Sayyid Qutb that provided the motive.
Although Qutb had been executed in Egypt years earlier, his brother, Muhammad Qutb, was a professor in Jeddah and became another mentor to Osama. Through him, Osama was introduced to a terrifyingly binary world. Qutb's philosophy was simple yet explosive. The world was divided in two, the world of Islam and the world of Jahiliyyah, barbarism or ignorance. To Osama, the skyscrapers his father built, the Western music his brothers listened to, and the American influence in the Middle East weren't signs of progress, they were signs of Jahiliyyah. This was the ideological seed. He began to view the United States and the Soviet Union not as superpowers, but as twin cancers eating away at the purity of his faith. This wasn't just religion, it was a cosmic war in the mind of an engineering student who believed that for something new to be built, the old structure had to be demolished. The engineering lens, West versus East. This is where the interesting investigation deepens. How does an engineer think? They look for flaws, they look for stress points. Osama began to apply his civil engineering logic to global politics. He saw the West, led by America, as a decaying bridge held up by materialism and greed. He saw the East, led by the Soviet Union, as a godless machine. He didn't see himself as a politician, he saw himself as a restorer. He started using his massive personal allowance to fund secret study circles. He was no longer the boy watching Western movies. He was the man analyzing how to bring the West to its knees. He became obsessed with the concept of Ghuraba, the strangers, a small elite vanguard that would change history. He believed that if he could find the right people and the right moment, he could trigger a collapse of the current world order. By 1979, the shy student from the bin Laden group was gone. In his place stood a man with $1 billion bank account and a radical blueprint for the future. He was a ticking bomb of ideology, waiting for a battlefield. And on Christmas Eve of that year, when Soviet tanks rolled into the dust of Kabul, Osama bin Laden didn't see a war. He saw his destiny. The classroom was over. The engineering of global terror was about to begin. The ghost of Syed Qutb, the why of the conflict. But if Azam provided the method, it was the teachings of Syed Qutb that provided the motive. Although Qutb had been executed in Egypt years earlier, his brother, Muhammad Qutb, was a professor in Jeddah and became another mentor to Osama. Through him, Osama was introduced to a terrifyingly binary world. Qutb's philosophy was simple yet explosive. The world was divided in two, the world of Islam and the world of Jahiliyyah, barbarism or ignorance. To Osama, the skyscrapers his father built, the Western music his brothers listened to, and the American influence in the Middle East weren't signs of progress, they were signs of Jahiliyyah. This was the ideological seed. He began to view the United States and the Soviet Union not as superpowers, but as twin cancers eating away at the purity of his faith. This wasn't just religion, it was a cosmic war in the mind of an engineering student who believed that for something new to be built, the old structure had to be demolished. The engineering lens, West versus East. This is where the interesting investigation deepens. How does an engineer think? They look for flaws, they look for stress points. Osama began to apply his civil engineering logic to global politics. He saw the West, led by America, as a decaying bridge held up by materialism and greed. He saw the East, led by the Soviet Union, as a godless machine. He didn't see himself as a politician, he saw himself as a restorer. He started using his massive personal allowance to fund secret study circles. He was no longer the boy watching Western movies. He was the man analyzing how to bring the West to its knees. He became obsessed with the concept of ghuraba, the strangers, a small elite vanguard that would change history. He believed that if he could find the right people and the right moment, he could trigger a collapse of the current world order. By 1979, the shy student from the bin Laden group was gone. In his place stood a man with $1 billion bank account and a radical blueprint for the future. He was a ticking bomb of ideology, waiting for a battlefield. And on Christmas Eve of that year, when Soviet tanks rolled into the dust of Kabul, Osama bin Laden didn't see a war. He saw his destiny.
The classroom was over. The engineering of global terror was about to begin. The Crucible, the Soviet-Afghan War, the earthquake of the East. On December 24, 1979, the world shifted. As Soviet tanks rolled across the Oxus River into the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, they weren't just invading a country, they were unknowingly summoning a ghost. For Osama bin Laden, this wasn't a geopolitical crisis, it was a personal awakening. While the West saw a Cold War move, Osama saw a holy call. He didn't wait for permission. Within weeks of the invasion, the 22-year-old billionaire arrived in Pakistan. He didn't come with a gun, but with something far more powerful, his family's checkbook and his engineering degree. This was the moment the golden boy of Jeddah stepped into the dust of war, forever leaving behind the air-conditioned palaces of his youth. The financier of the mountains. This is where the investigation gets fascinating. Osama didn't start as a fighter, he started as a foreman. He realized that the brave Mujahideen fighters were dying not just from Soviet bullets, but from a lack of infrastructure. Using his massive personal wealth and his family's construction connections, he began shipping bulldozers, excavators, and heavy earth-moving equipment from Saudi Arabia to the Afghan border. He was a combat engineer. He used his knowledge of soil mechanics and structural integrity to carve massive tunnels into the granite mountains of Tora Bora. He built hospitals under the earth, hidden from Soviet Mi-24 Hind gunships. He built roads through mountain passes that were previously impassable. To the fighters, he wasn't just a donor. He was the man who moved mountains for them. He was the billionaire who got his boots dirty in the same mud they died in. The Battle of Jaji, the birth of a myth. Until 1987, Osama was seen mostly as a financier. That changed at a place called Jaji. Against the advice of experienced Afghan commanders, Osama decided to build a permanent base, the Lion's Den or Masada, right under the nose of the Soviets. For weeks, a small group of Arab volunteers led by Osama faced the full might of the Soviet Special Forces. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning diesel. While bombs rained down, Osama refused to retreat. He was reportedly seen calm, walking through the fire, even when he was nearly captured. This was the turning point. The Lion's Den didn't just survive, it became the birthplace of the myth. The wealthy Saudi prince was now a warrior prince. The Arab world had found its hero, and Osama had found his confidence. He realized he didn't just need to fund a war, he could lead one. 1988, the birth of Al-Qaeda. As the Soviet Union began to withdraw in 1988, a new question arose. What happens to the thousands of trained, radicalized fighters? Osama and his mentor, Abdullah Azzam, had a disagreement. Azzam wanted to focus on Palestine, but Osama had a darker, more global vision. In August 1988, in a series of secret meetings in Peshawar, the blueprints for a new organization were drawn. We have seen the original handwritten minutes of these meetings. They don't call it a terrorist group, they call it Al-Qaeda al-Sulba, the solid base. The document outlined a vanguard that would act as a rapid reaction force for any conflict involving Muslims worldwide.
The base was never meant to be a country, it was meant to be a network, a shadow empire funded by the bin Laden fortune and fueled by the experience of the Afghan War. The Soviet Union was collapsing, but in its ashes, a new, more invisible enemy had been born. The engineer had finished his foundation. Now he was ready to build his house of terror.
The Rift, the Gulf War, and the Great Betrayal. 1990. The storm clouds over Kuwait. August 2, 1990. The world woke up to the sound of Iraqi boots on the streets of Kuwait City. Saddam Hussein, the iron-fisted leader of Iraq, had annexed his tiny, oil-rich neighbor in a matter of hours. But the real tremors were felt in Riyadh. The Saudi royal family, guardians of Islam's holiest sites, looked across their border in terror. They feared that the butcher of Baghdad wouldn't stop at Kuwait. They feared the Saudi oil fields were next. In this moment of national crisis, a tall, bearded man in traditional robes requested an urgent meeting with the Saudi leadership. It was Osama bin Laden. Fresh from his victory against the Soviet Union, Osama arrived not as a terrorist, but as a loyal son of the kingdom. He brought with him maps, engineering plans, and a bold proposal. "Do not invite the West," he told the royals. "I have 10,000 battle-hardened Arab mujahideen ready to defend this land. We defeated a superpower in the mountains of Afghanistan. We can stop Saddam in the sands of Arabia." The Great Betrayal, a kingdom's choice. This is the turning point that changed history. Osama believed his Lion's Den fighters were the ultimate shield of Islam, but King Fahd and the Saudi princes saw it differently. They looked at Osama's irregular militia and then at the high-tech, crushing power of the United States military. They chose the latter. When the king invited nearly 500,000 American infidel soldiers to set up bases on the sacred soil of the Arabian Peninsula, something inside Osama bin Laden snapped. For him, this was the great betrayal. To Osama, the presence of non-Muslim boots near Mecca and Medina was a spiritual occupation. He began to speak out openly against the House of Saud, the very family his father had served with total devotion. He called the king a traitor to the faith. The billionaire's son had now crossed a line from which there was no return. In 1991, the Saudi government, tired of his public dissent, stripped him of his passport and confined him to the city of Jeddah. But Osama was no longer a man who could be caged. The exile, from Riyadh to the dust of Sudan. By 1992, the rift was permanent. Osama managed to flee the kingdom, eventually finding refuge in the African nation of Sudan. This period is often overlooked, but it was here that he transformed from a guerrilla fighter into the global CEO of terror. Sudan's leader at the time, Omar al-Bashir, welcomed him with open arms. Osama brought his construction equipment, his engineers, and his millions. He began building a massive 500-mile highway from Khartoum to Port Sudan, employing thousands. But this was the ultimate double life. While his bulldozers were paving roads during the day, his lieutenants were building training camps in the dead of night. In Sudan, Al-Qaeda became a corporate terror network. He set up legitimate businesses, exporting sesame seeds, tanning leather, and trading in construction materials, all to launder money and provide cover for his operatives. He wasn't just a man in a cave, he was a CEO with a global portfolio. It was from Khartoum that he began to direct his first major strikes against American interests, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia. A stateless ghost. The Saudi government, under immense pressure from the United States, took the ultimate step in 1994. They revoked Osama bin Laden's citizenship.
He was now a man without a country, disowned by his family, and hunted by intelligence agencies. His fortune was frozen, but his resolve was ironclad. He lived in a modest house with his wives and children in Khartoum, surviving on a simple diet and sleeping on the floor, even as he managed a multi-million-dollar network. In 1996, Sudan, fearing international sanctions, asked him to leave. Once again, the billionaire-turned-exile had to move. He boarded a chartered plane with his loyal fighters and headed back to the only place on earth that would have him, the rugged, war-torn peaks of Afghanistan. The rift was complete. Osama bin Laden was no longer a Saudi construction magnate. He was a stateless revolutionary, and his sights were now set firmly on the far enemy, the United States of America. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon bring the world to a standstill.
The Declaration of War, the 90s escalation. A declaration written in blood. In August 1996, the world was focused on the Olympic Games in Atlanta and the rise of the digital age. But in the freezing, jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, a man was writing a document that would define the next quarter century. Osama bin Laden, now living in a primitive stone hut after being expelled from Sudan, issued his infamous fatwa. It was titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Mosques. This wasn't just a political statement, it was a psychological bridge. For the first time, he explicitly connected the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, the land of Mecca and Medina, to the suffering of Muslims in Palestine and Iraq. He wasn't just fighting a government, he was declaring a cosmic war against what he called the Zionist Crusader Alliance. The language was clinical and cold. He called on every Muslim to kill American soldiers, regardless of where they were. He argued that the far enemy, the United States, was the head of the snake, and until that head was cut off, the regimes in the Middle East would never fall. This was the moment the engineer became the architect of a global battlefield. The practice runs, the 1998 embassy bombings. If the 1996 fatwa was the blueprint, August 7, 1998 was the first major construction. Exactly 8 years to the day after the first U.S. troops arrived in Saudi Arabia, two massive explosions rocked the capital cities of Kenya and Tanzania. The attacks on the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were masterpieces of al-Qaeda's logistical precision. These were not random acts, they were simultaneous, a hallmark of bin Laden's tactical style. The Nairobi truck bomb was so powerful it shattered windows miles away. Over 200 people died, most of them local Africans, proving that for bin Laden, collateral damage meant nothing in the face of his greater cause. The investigation reveals a chilling detail. The bombers had lived as sleepers in Nairobi for years, running legitimate fish trading and clothing businesses while mapping the embassy's security. This was the first time the FBI realized that bin Laden wasn't just a man with a beard and a rifle. He was the head of an invisible, patient, and highly disciplined army. The USS Cole, a low-tech strike on a high-tech giant. By the year 2000, al-Qaeda's confidence was soaring. On October 12th, bin Laden launched what he considered his most poetic strike. In the port of Aden, Yemen, the USS Cole, one of the most advanced billion-dollar destroyers in the U.S. Navy, was refueling. A small, humble fiberglass boat approached the massive warship. The two men on board even smiled and waved at the American sailors. Seconds later, they detonated 500 pounds of C4. Explosives tore a 40-foot hole in the steel hull of the destroyer. This was bin Laden's message to the world.
He didn't need a navy or an air force to humiliate a superpower. He only needed 2 men and a boat. After the attack, bin Laden was seen in a video at a wedding in Afghanistan, reciting a poem about the shattered pride of the American fleet. The lion of the desert had proven that the giant could bleed. The franchise model, Al-Qaeda's global network. But how did he manage all this from a cave with no internet? This is the core of the investigation, the Al-Qaeda franchise model. Bin Laden revolutionized terrorism by turning Al-Qaeda into a McDonald's of terror. He didn't need to micromanage every cell. Instead, he created a decentralized system. Al-Qaeda was divided into 4 distinct committees: military, finance, religious, and media. 1. The core, a small group of elites in Afghanistan who provided the strategy and funding. 2. The affiliates, local groups in places like Algeria, Yemen, and the Philippines who took the Al-Qaeda brand name. 3. The cells, small independent groups across 60-plus countries. They lived ordinary lives as taxi drivers, students, and engineers, waiting for a single coded message to act. This was a corporate jihad. Operatives were required to submit expense reports and detailed after-action summaries of their missions. They used encrypted codes hidden in pornographic images or sports chat rooms. Bin Laden realized that by making Al-Qaeda a thought rather than just a place, he could make it indestructible. Even if he died, the franchise would continue. He was no longer just a leader, he was a brand. And the 90s were his years of global expansion, setting the stage for the most catastrophic event in modern history, the dawn of 9/11.
The day the world changed, September 11th. The logistics of chaos, the Hamburg cell. To the world, September 11th, 2001 appeared like a sudden bolt of lightning. But for Osama bin Laden and a small group of students in Germany, it was a project years in the making. This was the Hamburg cell. Investigation reveals that the key hijackers, Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and Ziad Jarrah, were not uneducated radicals from a desert. They were high-achieving, Western-educated students living in Hamburg, Germany. Atta was a student of urban planning. He was obsessed with how skyscrapers dominated the skyline of the Middle East. Bin Laden chose these men specifically because they could blend in. They lived ordinary lives, drank coffee in German cafes, and studied technical subjects, all while harboring a dark secret. Bin Laden provided the vision and the funding, but these men provided the Western disguise. They traveled to the United States, enrolled in flight schools in Florida, and even practiced their maneuvers on flight simulator games. This wasn't just a mission, it was a special operation conducted by men who understood the very systems they were about to destroy. The mastermind and the financier, KSM and Bin Laden. Behind every great architectural feat, there is an architect and a financier. For the 9/11 attacks, the roles were clear. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, known as KSM, was the restless, creative mastermind who first brought the Bojinka plot, using planes as missiles, to bin Laden's cave in 1996. At first, bin Laden was skeptical, but as his hatred for the far enemy grew, he saw the genius in KSM's madness. Their relationship was a professional one. KSM was the project manager who handled the technical details, the recruitment, and the operational security. Bin Laden was the chairman who provided the multi-million-dollar budget and the final approval. They met in secret locations across Afghanistan, refining the plan. Bin Laden personally interviewed the planesmen, choosing the 19 hijackers from a pool of hundreds of volunteers. He looked for men who were ready to die, but also men who could handle the psychological pressure of living in America for months without being caught.
Bin Laden's engineering background came into play here. He calculated the exact amount of jet fuel needed to weaken the steel structures of the Twin Towers. He didn't just want to hit the buildings, he wanted them to collapse. The day of the storm, September 11th. On the morning of September 11th, bin Laden was not in a cave. He was in a safe house near Jalalabad, huddled around a small radio with his inner circle. As the first plane hit the North Tower, he reportedly told his followers to be patient. More was coming. The 19 hijackers exploited a fatal flaw in American security. They used small box cutters to turn civilian aircraft into strategic missiles. In less than 2 hours, nearly 3,000 people from 90 different countries were gone. The symbols of American economic, military, and political power had been struck. For bin Laden, it was a tactical success beyond his wildest dreams. He had managed to strike the head of the snake with a budget of less than $500,000, causing trillions of dollars in damage and changing the course of human history. The immediate aftermath, the War on Terror. The world that woke up on September 12th was unrecognizable. The geopolitical landscape had suffered a tectonic shift. Within days, President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror. The far enemy had been awakened, and it was angry. The immediate result was the invasion of Afghanistan. Bin Laden had predicted this. He wanted to lure the United States into a bleeding war, a quagmire similar to what the Soviets faced in the 80s. He believed that the American public would not have the stomach for a long, bloody conflict. But the War on Terror went much further. It led to the creation of the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, and a massive shift in how the world viewed travel, privacy, and security. Every airport security line today, every drone strike in the Middle East, and every shift in the map of the modern world can be traced back to that Tuesday morning. Bin Laden had achieved his goal. He had forced the superpower to reveal its raw power, and in doing so, he set the stage for a decades-long conflict that would eventually lead him to his final stand in a quiet compound in Pakistan.
The Ghost of Tora Bora, The Manhunt. The Fortress of Dust, Tora Bora. December 2001. The world's focus was narrow and intense, locked onto a jagged patch of the White Mountains in eastern Afghanistan, known as Tora Bora. Beneath these peaks lay a labyrinth of caves, some natural, some carved by bin Laden's own construction equipment years earlier. The U.S. military was certain they had him trapped. They dropped thousands of tons of explosives, including the massive daisy cutter bombs that shook the very foundation of the earth. Delta Force and British SBS operators were on the ground, closing in. But inside the smoke and the fire, bin Laden was playing a different game. While the world watched the spectacle of high-tech warfare, the engineer was utilizing the oldest trick in the book: the geography of the land and the loyalty of the tribes. The Great Escape, vanishing into thin air. Investigation reveals that the Great Escape was not a miracle, it was a failure of intelligence. As the bombs fell on the front lines, bin Laden was already moving. He didn't escape in a high-speed convoy. He left on foot and on horseback, guided by local Pashtun tribesmen who knew every hidden goat path through the Spingar Range. There is a chilling detail from intercepted radio chatter. U.S. forces reportedly heard his voice on a short-range radio, giving orders to his fighters to stay and die while he slipped through a snowy pass toward the Parachinar area of Pakistan. By the time the special forces reached the deep bunkers of Tora Bora, the bird had flown. The man who orchestrated 9/11 had vanished into the gray zone, the lawless tribal areas where satellite tracking meant nothing and gold meant everything.
This was the moment bin Laden became a ghost. The silent decade, the man in the shadows. For the next 10 years, the world lived in a state of Schrodinger's terrorist. Was he dead? Was he in a cave? Was he on dialysis in a remote hospital? While the CIA and MI6 spent billions of dollars on high-tech surveillance, bin Laden was living a life of radical simplicity that was his ultimate defense. He understood a fundamental truth of the digital age. If you are online, you are traceable. So, he went completely offline. No phones, no internet, no electronic signals. He lived in a series of safe houses, eventually moving to the suburban quiet of Abbottabad. But being silent didn't mean being inactive. This was the era of the messenger tapes. Every few months, a grainy video or a crisp audio recording would appear on Al Jazeera. These weren't sent via email. They were passed through a human chain, a Pony Express of terror. A messenger would carry a thumb drive or a cassette tape across 3 countries, changing cars and clothes until it reached a media outlet. Through these tapes, bin Laden stayed relevant. He commented on the Iraq War, the global economy, and U.S. elections. He was mocking the superpowers from his living room, proving that you don't need a satellite to lead a movement. You only need a message and a trusted courier. The CEO in hiding, managing Al-Qaeda from a room. The most shocking discovery from the later investigation of his hard drives was that bin Laden was not just hiding, he was micromanaging. From his secluded compound, he was sending detailed letters to Al-Qaeda affiliates in North Africa, Yemen, and Iraq. He was worried about the brand. He criticized his lieutenants for killing too many Muslim civilians, fearing it would turn the public against them. He was an editor, a strategist, and a critic. He spent his days watching news channels like CNN and BBC, analyzing his enemies' moves like a grand master at a chessboard. While the CIA was looking for him in the rugged caves of Waziristan, he was living in a 3-story house, walking in a small garden under a makeshift roof to hide from drones, and raising his youngest children in total isolation. He had turned his life into a prison of his own making, all to keep the base alive. He was a ghost haunting the global security apparatus, waiting for a day that he knew, with the precision of an engineer, was eventually coming.
Operation Neptune Spear, the final act. The fatal flaw, the courier's trail. For years, the CIA was chasing a ghost, looking for a needle in a haystack of digital noise. But bin Laden's greatest strength, his total lack of electronic communication, became his ultimate weakness. He had to rely on a human connection. Intelligence officers began focusing on a single alias, Abu Ahmed al-Qaiti. Detainees in black sites had whispered this name, describing him as the only man bin Laden truly trusted. In 2010, the CIA finally intercepted a phone call from al-Qaiti. It wasn't what he said, but where he was. They tracked his white Suzuki Jeep through the crowded streets of Peshawar, all the way to a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Abbottabad, just a mile away from Pakistan's elite military academy. The CIA looked at the house on satellite imagery and realized this was no ordinary residence. It had 18-foot-high walls topped with barbed wire, no windows facing the street, and, most suspiciously, the residents burned their trash instead of putting it out for collection. There was no phone line, no internet. Inside this fortress of silence, the CIA spotted a tall man walking circles in the garden, covered by a low-hanging tarp. They called him the Pacer. They didn't have a clear photo of his face, but the engineering of the house told them everything. This was the lair of the world's most hunted man. May 2nd, 2011, the Midnight Raid. The operation was dubbed Neptune Spear.
On a moonless night in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, 24 members of the elite SEAL Team 6 boarded two modified stealth Black Hawk helicopters. Their destination, a compound that didn't exist on any public map. 2300 local time, the helicopters crossed the border, flying low through the valleys to avoid Pakistani radar. 12:30 a.m., as they arrived over the compound, disaster struck. One helicopter caught in a vortex of its own rotor wash and crashed into the courtyard. The silence of the night was shattered. The element of surprise was gone. 12:35 a.m., the SEALs didn't hesitate. They blew through the gates and walls with C4 explosives. They moved with surgical precision. One team cleared the guest house, killing the courier Al-Qaiti. Another team entered the main house. 12:40, room by room, floor by floor, in the pitch black, lit only by the green glow of night vision goggles, the SEALs moved up the stairs. On the second floor, they encountered bin Laden's adult son, Khalid. He was killed in the stairwell. 12:44 a.m., the SEALs reached the third floor. A tall, bearded man peered out from a doorway. Shots were fired. As the SEALs entered the room, they found the man slumped on the floor. One of the wives tried to protect him, but it was over. The operator spoke the words that would echo through the White House Situation Room: Geronimo, EKIA. In just 38 minutes, a decade-long hunt had ended. But they didn't just take the body, they stripped the house of every hard drive, every notebook, and every scrap of paper, the largest treasure trove of intelligence in the history of the War on Terror. The geopolitical shockwaves, U.S. versus Pakistan. The aftermath was an explosion of diplomatic fury. The fact that Osama bin Laden was living in a massive, fortified house in a military town surrounded by the Pakistani army raised a devastating question. Was Pakistan hiding him, or were they simply incompetent? The relationship between Washington and Islamabad went into a deep freeze. For the U.S., it was proof of a double game. For Pakistan, the raid was a violation of their sovereignty. The tension was so high that Pakistani F-16s were scrambled that night to intercept the SEALs, missing them by only minutes as they crossed back into Afghanistan. Publicly, the world celebrated. In front of the White House and at Ground Zero, crowds chanted USA, USA. But in the intelligence world, the celebration was quiet. They knew that while the head was gone, the body of the organization had already transformed. The legacy of a ghost, Al-Qaeda after bin Laden. Bin Laden's death didn't end Al-Qaeda, it decentralized it. He had already built the franchise model we discussed earlier. His successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was a brilliant ideologue, but lacked the warrior prince charisma of bin Laden. The death of the founder led to the rise of even more radical groups like ISIS, who felt bin Laden's Al-Qaeda had become too soft. But the true impact of his death was the end of an era. The man who began as a billionaire's son, became a billionaire's soldier, and ended as a billionaire's ghost, was buried at sea from the deck of the USS Carl Vinson. No grave, no shrine, no place for his followers to gather. The engineer had been dismantled by very systems he tried to destroy. But as the SEALs flew away into the sunrise, they left behind a world that had been permanently scarred by one man's blueprint of terror. The architect of shadows was gone, but the shadows he cast still loom over the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century.
The legacy of Ash, a headless hydra. On the night of May 2nd, 2011, as the news of Osama bin Laden's death flashed across the neon screens of Times Square, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Many believed that the nightmare was finally over, that with the death of the architect, the building of terror would collapse. But the investigation of the following decade tells a much darker, more complex story. Bin Laden was a master of the long game. He knew that his physical body was a temporary vessel, but his ideology was a permanent virus.
His death did not end the movement. It triggered a massive, violent decentralization. Imagine a single tree being cut down, only for its seeds to be scattered by the wind across entire continents. With the central command in Pakistan weakened, Al-Qaeda didn't vanish, it evolved. It gave birth to franchises that were often more brutal than the original. From the desert sands of Mali to the jungles of the Philippines, local insurgencies began to brand themselves with his name. And most significantly, the power vacuum and the radicalization he fostered eventually paved the way for the rise of ISIS, a group so extreme that even bin Laden's successors felt they had gone too far. He had turned a single organization into a global thought, and as the world found out, you cannot kill a thought with a bullet. The haunting reflection, a world permanently altered. Look at the world around you today. If you feel that your life is different from those who lived in the 1990s, it is because of the shadows cast by this one man. Osama bin Laden's true legacy is not written in the history books of war, but in the daily lives of billions. Consider the way we travel. Before 2001, airport security was a minor inconvenience. Today, it is a high-tech ritual of suspicion. We have surrendered our privacy for the promise of safety. Every liquid bottle discarded at a checkpoint, every body scanner, and every no-fly list is a silent monument to his influence. Politics, too, was permanently poisoned. The war on terror didn't just stay in Afghanistan and Iraq, it came home to the West. It fueled the rise of surveillance states, the expansion of drone warfare, and a deep-seated polarization between the East and the West. He wanted to provoke a clash of civilizations, and in many ways he succeeded. He forced the world's greatest democracies to question their own values, to choose between liberty and security. The trillions of dollars spent on these wars could have built cities, cured diseases, and ended hunger. Instead, that wealth was turned into ash and smoke, consumed by a fire that bin Laden started in a cave with nothing but a camera and a conviction. The scars of 25 years, an investigative map. If we were to look at a satellite map of the world from 25 years ago and compare it to today, the scars would be visible from space. Not just the physical scars of cratered landscapes in Aleppo, Mosul, and Kabul, but the invisible scars of displaced millions. We see a world that is more guarded, more fearful, and more divided. The Arab Spring, the refugee crisis in Europe, the rise of far-right movements, all of these can be traced back through a series of domino effects to that Tuesday morning in September. Bin Laden's engineering mind understood stress points. He knew that if he hit the right spot, the entire structure of global peace would fracture. He was an architect, not of buildings, of chaos. The closing shot, zooming out from the dusty streets of Abbottabad. As we zoom out from the dusty streets of Abbottabad, past the borders of Pakistan, over the burning horizons of the Middle East, and across the oceans to the skylines of the West, we see a planet that is still healing, and perhaps a planet that will never be the same again. The story of Osama bin Laden is a terrifying reminder of the power of a single individual, not for good, but for destruction. He was a man who had everything and chose to destroy it all, taking a significant portion of the world's peace with him. The fire he lit may have dimmed with his death, but the legacy of ash remains. It is in the news we read, the laws we follow, and the fears we harbor. As the screen fades to black, we are left with one haunting question. In the battle between the architect of terror and the world he tried to break, who really won? The towers fell, the man is gone, but the shadows are still here. The rise and fall of Osama bin Laden is more than just a chapter in a history book. It is a lesson in how ideas can reshape our world in ways we never imagined. If you found this deep dive investigation insightful, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe the world is safer today than it was 25 years ago? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more in-depth documentaries on the events and figures that shaped our modern history. This is Ancient Mysteries signing off. Thank you for watching.